On behalf of Namita Gokhale, William Dalrymple, and all my colleagues at Teamwork Arts, welcome back to JLF's Brave New World. Our magazine partner for this series is The Week, Journalism with a Human Touch. We're delighted to present our first session of the day in partnership with the University of York and its student union that has launched a new engagement platform called York Ideas. Our session for the day, On Fire, the burning case for a Green New Deal. Naomi Klein in conversation with Kiran Trehan. Naomi Klein talks about the urgent need to combat the profound global impacts of the intersection of the climate crisis and the COVID-19 pandemic. I'm delighted to have Joan Concannon, who is our wonderful partner for JLF from across the world and is the Director of External Relations and Director of the York Festival of Ideas, and our partner to introduce the session. Joan, welcome to JLF's Brave New World, and over to you.
Good evening and welcome to everybody who is here this evening, and thank you so much for joining us. My name's Joan Concannon and I'm Director of External Relations at the University of York, and I'm also the Director of York Festival of Ideas, which was created and is led by the university. It gives me enormous pleasure to kick off a new season of events, albeit online, and a new platform for engagement, York Ideas, which was born out of the rapid transition of the Festival of Ideas earlier this year to the virtual world, which saw us host 97 events with 45 partners, reaching more than 43,000 people from 130 countries around the world. So we're now extending the use of York Ideas as a year-round platform of engagement. We want to use York Ideas as a way of demonstrating that York is a university for public good by developing and delivering free events in partnership with a range of exciting and innovative organisations. Our launch event tonight with the renowned writer Naomi Klein is delivered in partnership with our fantastic York Student Union, but also our wonderful Festival of Ideas partner, the Jaipur Literary Festival, the largest free festival in the world. JLF's virtual Brave New World platform has now reached 17.4 million viewers around the world, and I'm delighted that the director of JLF, Sanjoy Roy, will deliver a vote of thanks later this evening. The climate crisis and COVID together are the two most existential threats to humanity right now. There can be no better time, therefore, to launch a platform dedicated to the advancement of new ideas, collaborations, and actions to combat both crises. It's fantastic that Naomi Klein can be with us on this evening to discuss these complex and compelling issues, just as her book has now been published in paperback. All of Naomi's books are available for loan and digital access for all York staff and students at our university library. And we're delighted to announce that we're conducting a huge prize draw for students attending Naomi's talk to win paper copies of On Fire. Winners will be contacted after the event, and signed copies of Naomi's book are available for sale via our partner bookseller, Fox Lane Books. Please look in the chat for further details. So in essence, York Ideas aims to celebrate human ingenuity and to foster education and empowerment around the world. In that regard, York students are also stepping up to the challenge.
Thank you so much for those remarks, and everybody for being here. This is a really innovative format, and short of being in person, this is, I think, the next best thing. I want to thank Joan Concannon, the director of the York Festival of Ideas, and everybody at the festival for inviting me here, to everyone at University of York. I'm greatly looking forward to our conversation soon, Kiran. And before I offer a few remarks, I would love to share with you a short film. You'll be the first audience to share it together. We launched it just a couple of hours ago. People have been watching it on their phones and on their screens, but never at an event before. And I won't say too much about it. I think it should speak for itself. Beyond simply saying that I think we all know that these are times when it is challenging to remain hopeful. We understand that we face crises on a global scale. If we're thinking about the ecological crisis, an existential crisis for our species. And yet in the political sphere, we do not have solutions on the scale of the crisis, which is why young people are marching in the streets demanding that leaders treat the climate emergency like an emergency. And I believe that part of why we are in the situation we are in, and there's many, many reasons, but part of it has to do with a failure of imagination, that we can't get to where we need to go if we don't have the courage to picture it. And in many ways, we are locked within various kinds of apocalyptic fantasies. There is a deluge of dystopian visions of the future being created, many of them very captivating and powerful. And when authors and filmmakers produce these kinds of visions of the future, they're hoping to warn us. They're saying to us, look, this is where the road you're on is leading if you don't swerve. But one of the things that I've always found a little bit troubling is if these dystopian versions of our future that kind of mix ecological collapse with various kinds of supremacist ideologies, greater inequality, if this kind of mix and match collapsitarian future is the only vision that we see, then does it perhaps not start to feel less like a warning and more like a prophecy, one that we can't change? So the idea behind this little short that I'm going to share with you is just to try to imagine another kind of future. There are many different kinds of futures that we can imagine, and this is just a group of us who did our best to try to show you one of them. So let's roll that clip, and then I'll come back.
Looking back, it's hard to believe that we've rebuilt our community from the ground up with our own hands. The first seeds were planted way back in the terror and tenderness of the pandemic. And then change bloomed in the streets, in the fire and struggle of the uprisings. Around here, we'll never forget the day that the last prisoners were released, walking out into the arms of their loved ones. The easy part was finding work. The Community Care Corps was always looking for people in those days, whether for universal family care, burying border walls, or green new public housing, going up one pod at a time. Yep, it was a good time for busy hands.
Funny, thinking back to the first wave of the pandemic, that's what you really remember. Hands. Washing, scrubbing, disinfecting, washing again. Picturing each other's hands. All the hands that had touched whatever we were touching. The hands that packed the box, that picked the tomato, that planted the seed. The hands that stroked the brow, that said goodbye. The hands were us. All of us. That web of hand-to-hand, breath-to-breath relationships was a reminder. We are all entangled, making each other sick, keeping each other alive. That was just one of the lessons of COVID-19. It started in the first great pause, when the smog cleared and the rich fled the cities, when poverty dropped its disguise and racist inequality drew the map of the disease. As the roar of the traffic faded, we arose to birdsong and ambulance sirens. The virus showed us what was truly essential. And we learned again and again that so many of us doing essential work were being treated as sacrificial. From nursing homes to detention facilities, meatpacking plants and fulfillment centers, the virus exposed the cruelty of these warehouses of efficiency and profit. Then, things got worse. In 2023, super droughts led to mega floods. Locusts carved a path across continents and hyper typhoons drove millions from their homes. COVID-23 raced through storm shelters and refugee camps. Supplies ran out again. Meanwhile, dinosaurs roamed the halls of power, bellowing that more sacrifice was needed. But every time they cranked up that rusty old machine called economic growth, the cloud of sickness and death grew.
And we couldn't breathe. Couldn't breathe from the asthma in our polluted communities, from the smoke of those fires. We couldn't breathe with a knee on our necks, in the clouds of tear gas as we shouted, "Black Lives Matter." And that is how the virus changed everything. We finally understood that we couldn't keep patching up the same broken systems. We had to build something new. What was needed was a spark. That spark was us. After months of organizing, the viral rent strike was like a starting gun. Then came the essential workers' strike. Delivery drivers, street cleaners, and farm workers got together and said, enough. This time, people didn't just clap from their balconies. We flooded into the streets to join together. One of the leaders was Luciela, a young food courier. When a police bullet stole her life, the crowds exploded in size and then exploded again, spreading across borders like a counter-virus. The sparks looked different in every country as the wildfire strikes leapt across borders. Economies ground to a halt, this time blockaded by workers. We lost too many young heroes as states brought out the iron fist, but it was no match for the raised fist of solidarity. Soon, authoritarian rulers started to topple like statues, and new governments were suddenly nervous about ignoring the streets. We joined hands and pushed further, launching the years of repair.
The first step was rebuilding the economy around the core of essential work: food and farming, care for young and old, public health. Not to mention the essential labor of the more than human world, the winged pollinators, the leafy oxygen makers. The Full Employment Act made the new priorities clear, and there was a wave of new worker cooperatives in everything from mental health support to public art and tree planting. Many bosses were made redundant. Our information ecology needed tending too, and so we built a digital commons, vaccinated it against surveillance, and built up our herd immunity to disinformation. Fossil fuels were running on fumes by that point, so we harnessed their final profits to clean up their messes. Whatever we could, we did outdoors. School, theatre, celebrating. At first because it was safer, then because we realised it made us happier. Nobody talked about missing shopping. Anyway, the right to repair movement meant that a lot of stuff got fixed rather than thrown away and replaced. With life moving at a slower pace, we finally had time to look back. And we began the most important repair of all: repairing relationships. In colonial countries like the US, Canada, Australia, and the UK, those were hard conversations. But truth and reparations commissions helped some of us face the truth about the violent conquests of the past and how they shaped our world. That guided where we repaired and how. It turned out that once we fully funded schools and housing and healthcare, we didn't need those bloated budgets for policing, prisons, and war. And ultimately, the flow of money on planet Earth had to be reversed. So the North finally started paying its debts, and the South finally stopped.
Around here, the Land Back program began the historic process of returning some of the stolen land to indigenous jurisdiction. In the process, we remembered how taking care of the earth lays the ground for taking care of each other. Within just a few years, we could see the bottom of the river again, and it was safe to drink and fish in its waters. Things aren't perfect, of course. Between mutating viruses and our warming world, there's always new storms headed our way. But when they come, we're ready. With our networks of nurses and neighbors, our small farms and big forests, our systems of care and repair, no one is sacrificed. Everyone is essential.
Welcome, welcome Naomi. It's a real delight and a privilege. I'm Kiran Trehan and I'm Pro Vice Chancellor for Partnerships and Engagement. And on behalf of the university and everybody listening, we are really privileged to have you here and to hear about the inspiring work that you're doing. But before we start engaging, in a conversation to pick up on some of the really important things that you've raised in this book, I just want to spend a couple of minutes just giving the opportunity for our audience to realise the inspiring work that you have done, because you're not simply award-winning journalist and economist and documentary filmmaker. You've authored some really important books, tackling really big issues like No Logo, The Shock Doctrine, This Changes Everything, No Is Not Enough. And then it's just wonderful to have had the opportunity, to read On Fire, which is what we're going to be kind of discussing today. And let's not forget, it's reached, it's been translated into 30 languages, across the world. And one of the things that I was really struck was your activism, the inspiring work that you are doing in terms of climate justice, and being co-founder of the organisation, the LEAP organisation. You walk the talk in terms of the work that you do. So I want to just start by asking you about your inspiration, to continue lead this agenda just so authentically.
Well, thank you. And thank you so much for that lovely introduction. One of the things that's really exciting about that little film that we just watched, and I have to send huge love to our brilliant collaborator, Molly Crabapple, who is the woman behind the hands painting those beautiful images. And it's a follow-up to a film that we did a year ago called Message from the Future, from Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and it was the story of how we won a Green New Deal. And we, when we decided to just start tentatively brainstorming about doing a sequel, the pandemic was, we were 3 weeks into lockdown, and we were just feeling like, do we even have a right to imagine a better future? Molly and I had both been pretty deep in the Bernie Sanders campaign. And so there was something about the kind of convergence of Bernie losing, us ending up with a very sort of middle of the road candidate to take on Trump, and then the pandemic hitting and all of us being separate, that really honestly made it harder to find inspiration and hope, frankly, than at any other point in my life. And so this question, it's tough, because I think hope is something that you don't just have. I think it's something that you have to earn. And it's a choice, and it's a choice that we need to rebuild every day, as James Baldwin famously said. And there's a wonderful book out about what that means, called Begin Again by Eddie Glaude, that I cite in the essay going to go with that film. Every day we must begin again, right? To find our hope, to find our inspiration. But for me, it always comes from movements, is the short answer, right? And in making this follow-up, we made this very deliberate decision that politicians can't be the star this time. We love AOC, you know, and she inspires us, and so does the whole squad, and they're getting bigger, and we're sending more, you know, movement leaders to Congress this year. People like Jamal Bowman, Cori Bush, you know, who's very much one of the leaders of the Black Lives Matter movement. She won the primary, but at this point, it really is movements that are going to grab the wheel of history or not. It isn't going to come from on high. That doesn't mean there's no role for politicians. We need people on the inside to meet us. But so when we crafted this follow-up, we made this decision that the stars were going to be movement leaders, and some of them are, you know, the voices you hear, like Opal Tometi, who's one of the founders of BLM. And Nimo Bassey, who is a longtime climate justice warrior from Nigeria, as well as the two amazing actors, Emma Thompson and Gael Garcia Bernal. But the really exciting part is the coalition that we were able to assemble behind the vision. So once we had storyboards, we went to the Movement for Black Lives, the NDN Collective, which is an Indigenous coalition, that is fighting for a future where Indigenous land is returned to Indigenous jurisdiction. So, you know, I think hope and inspiration, it has to be rooted in some kind of pathway to realizing the future that we want, right? And so this has been a good day, because this is a new kind of experiment for us, of like kind of making this sort of utopian art, but having this coalition of real world movements that are pushing for all the things, like their own piece of it, that we show in that film, whether it's, you know, true respect and dignity for nurses, essential workers. We're working with the Global Nurses Union on this. So yeah, it's that movement. Without those connections to movements that are putting ideas into action, I think I wouldn't have any hope for the moment that we're in, because I'm certainly not getting it from politicians right now.
Thank you, Naomi. That's really helped lay some of the foundation. And before we start, you know, into our dialogue and our conversation, I want to give you the opportunity to do your presentation, from which I know there'll be, you know, 101 really exciting questions, and I'm very much looking forward to our conversation with. So over to you. Thank you.
Yeah, well, I won't take up too much more time, because I have been talking, but you know, we're sort of launching the paperback of On Fire today, which is a collection of essays that I published a year ago, the subtitle of which is The Burning Case for a Green New Deal. And the question 1 year later for me is, you know, are we closer or further from the idea of a truly transformational response to the climate crisis, one that is not in kind of a narrow climate policy, but is really about building the next economy and solving multiple crises at once. So, you know, back to the title of the book, On Fire, you know, it comes from one of the chapters in the book, which is a description of living through historic wildfires where I am now on the West Coast. You know, once again, our skies are choked in wildfire smoke. And there's a kind of relentless to what summer is like now, and increasingly fall, because of these massive fires. And it's even hard to convey just how huge they are. But the plume of smoke is reaching Europe. I mean, that is how the size of the land that is burning here. And you breathe the air and your eyes water and you have a catch in your throat. And you know that you are breathing in forest, you are breathing in animal life that has died. You know, 5 of the largest fires in California's history were burning simultaneously in August. That's how big these fires were, in September. Since I published On Fire a year ago, Australia burned in these kinds of epic fires. Last summer, we were all horrified by the fires in the Amazon, and the Amazon is on fire once again now. It is a combination of the impacts of the climate crisis, just drier, hotter temperatures, but it is also the fact that these lands are being taken from indigenous people, and in the Amazon, ranchers, miners are deliberately setting them on fire in order to seize the lands. In North America, the dynamic is different. Indigenous knowledge has been suppressed when indigenous lands were taken, and indigenous people in the Americas have always known that these forests need fire. But because of the approach that was taken to conservation by Western environmental movements, there was this fire suppression ethos, which basically saw fire as the enemy always. So if there was ever any kind of fire, it was immediately put out. But in fact, fire is a natural form of regeneration. It clears away it clears away dead wood. It clears away debris. It makes room for new growth. It releases seeds. It is part of the life cycle. So you have the impacts of the suppressing of indigenous knowledge, of stealing indigenous land, that makes the fires worse. In California, another factor that has made the fires worse is that California relies on a huge amount of prison labor to fight its fires. And with COVID, many prisoners have been released, including prisoners that were deemed the lowest risk. And these were the prisoners who were most likely to become firefighters. And then COVID also spread through many prisons and many of the prison firefighting camps, which meant that they weren't able to send prisoners out to fight fires. And so one part of the reason, a small part of the reason why the fires spread as quickly as they did, is because California was very short-staffed when it came to firefighters. So you have this conflation of many different crises in these fires, the impacts of racism, mass incarceration, indigenous land theft, climate change, and all of it just mixing together. And so in On Fire, I talk about how we can't really separate out the fires. We've got the climate fires. We also have the fires of surging supremacist logics around the world. And I say supremacist logics, not just white supremacy, although that is certainly the form of supremacy that we are dealing with in North America. But it takes different forms around the world. And we have supremacist logics at work in Modi's India, in Duterte's Philippines, in Netanyahu's Israel. And many of these strongmen leaders are supporting each other, trading technologies, trading, what I call worst practices. So we have these intersecting fires of ecological collapse, and the political fires of hatred that these figures are willfully spreading. And of course, we saw a really dramatic example of this a couple of nights ago when Donald Trump refused to simply condemn white supremacists from the debate stage, which was a horrifying and shocking, well, not shocking, a horrifying, unshocking moment that actually fits with many ways in which he has been fueling the fires of white supremacy since he ran for president. On this campaign that really follows the playbook of so many of these other leaders of having a sharply defined in-group and a sharply defined out-group of others, the invaders, the terrorists, the people carrying disease at the border, and so on. And so you build your power, you build your base by defining your in-group, and then you have to continue to wage war on the out-group. And I think that one of the things that I try to get at is On Fire is the way in which these forces fuel one another, because the more insecure people feel, whether economically or ecologically, and here I'm not really interested in whether people are consciously thinking about climate change or not. We all know on a cellular level that our home, our collective home, the natural systems on which all of life depend, that they are in crisis, and that breeds an intense kind of insecurity and makes us, I think, ripe for these strongmen figures and their various forms of xenophobia and supremacist logics, whether it's Matteo Salvini or Trump or Bolsonaro in Brazil. And so I think it's really important for us to understand that these are kind of twin fires, the climate crisis, the climate fires, and these political fires, the fires of hatred. And the overarching message of On Fire is that there is a third fire, and that fire is us, or as Nemo says in the script, in the film that you just watched, we just needed a spark, and the spark was us. That's a little bit borrowed from the UK climate strikers, who say Greta was the spark, but we are the wildfire. And I think that social movements have the power to be another kind of fire, to tap into the healing power of fire that I was referring to earlier, the kind of fire that makes way for new growth, that makes way for new futures, that allows seeds to be released in the heat of those fires. And that's what we were trying to show in that film, of what can happen when movements find their fire. So, I see this as an outward process, but I also see it as an inward process, because I think that we are all acutely aware that we are alive and breathing during a monumentally important moment in human history. And we need to meet that moment with everything that we have, with our full capacity for transformation, for unity. We need to be as powerful as we possibly can be. And I think we often have a sense that we are not as fully present and powerful as this moment demands, that we aren't meeting the intersecting crises with the kind of power that they deserve. And so when I say that it's inward, I think we all need to go through a process of looking inside and trying to figure out what debris inside of ourselves we need to clear away in order to be as powerful as we need to be in this present moment. Maybe it's some sense of kind of intense propriety about it being slightly unseemly to join an activist movement and shout slogans in the streets. I know that's something that I've had to struggle with. And maybe it's an entirely understandable fear of political repercussions if you take those kinds of risks. But whatever it is, I think we need to locate if there is any debris that we need to kind of burn away in order to be as present and on fire as our moment of intersecting crises demands of us. The climate crisis, the pandemic, the crisis of obscene economic inequality, the crisis of racism and supremacist logic of all kinds. So it's a lot. The good news is we aren't in it alone. There are millions and millions and millions of us around the world. As you saw in the film, we kind of cast COVID as not an enemy, as often we hear political leaders like Boris Johnson talking about COVID as the unseen enemy, and they get their Churchill on and they talk about how they're going to wage war against this virus. When I was in Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria, I talked to a lot of people there who described Hurricane Maria as our teacher. They would talk about the hurricane as being this very tough teacher who had unveiled all of these things that were broken in this society before the crisis hit, before the hurricane came. And that really informed the way I have tried to see this horrific pandemic, with all the loss that surrounds us, as an unveiling and as a teacher. And I hope that one of the lessons that we are learning is that we have not been counting some of the most essential things in life, some of the most essential labor, the most essential people, some of what we found most essential when we had to lock down. And that's true in our failure to value the natural world, to value the water and air that we all depend on. And it's also true of the failure to value the labor of care that nurses and home care workers and teachers do every day. So if we take those lessons in, then it gives us a kind of a blueprint for what the next economy should look like. And I use this phrase, moving from a culture of extraction, of taking without limit, to a culture and an economy built on care and repair. And I think that the idea of repair, and we call the film The Years of Repair, is a really generous and expansive one, because it includes the need for us to repair the damage done to our built environment, to our physical world. We know that this virus has been so much more lethal because of the ways in which we have systematically abandoned what Ruth Wilson Gilmore calls organized abandonment, the deliberate starving of our hospitals, our schools, our elder care facilities. And we need to rebuild that. We need to invest in it, and we need to reimagine as we rebuild. We also need that same ethos of repair in repairing the tremendous damage done to our natural world, in rehabilitating and rewilding habitats. Because of course, one of the lessons of COVID and so many other diseases that jump from animals to human is that the damage that we do to the natural world comes back on us. But an ethos of repair also invites us to reparation, to repairing the damage done, the historical crimes that we have never fully confronted. You know, the UK paid reparations for slavery to the slave owners, not the slaves. At the velocity of capitalism, we are always told we can't look back. It's never a good time to look backwards, because capitalism requires constant forward momentum and growth. But COVID has forced us to slow down. And in that slowness, there is a chance, an opening for us to do this work of deep repair within all of the prophetic traditions of reparation and repair. So I'll end it there, and thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much, Naomi. I was really struck by the passionate and compelling arguments that you make, you know, the powerful case for change, you know, and also the complexities, you know, within the context of that. And in our conversation, I want to weave some of the incredible questions that are kind of coming through in relation to that. And so the first thing I want to pick up on, I really like this notion of care and repair in the way that you've just kind of articulated. How does care and repair sit alongside economic and environmental and political competing pressures within the context of the world that we live in? And that's been a theme of a number of questions that have come through, with people, you know, committed to the cause and committed to action, but also almost feeling constrained within the kind of context and the world that we live in. So, you know, just some short thoughts and reflections, you know, in terms of the compatibility of the two and how we move forward. That's huge, I know.
Yeah, I mean, it is huge, and I'm not sure it does fit within the narrow political confines that we find ourselves in. But I do think that it helps to find some language for it. You know, one of the things that I think we suffer from is excessive compartmentalization. It's certainly an issue in academia. It's an issue in social movements as well. You know, we have the sort of the feminism box and the race box and the economics box and the environment box. And, you know, people are not encouraged to leave their individual boxes or silos. And so, you know, the reason why I use this terminology around care and repair is that I think it helps us see ourselves in each other's boxes and each other's movements. I think it has that ability to connect the dots. And you know, when I talk about the power of social movements, it isn't as individual social movements. I think we've kind of hit the wall of how much we can do just as a climate movement, you know, or just as a racial justice movement. We have to build a true movement of movements that is everybody who is getting a raw deal under the current system, which is most people. That is where there is a huge amount of power. And the power is to change politics, right? I mean, I say it's tough within the political sphere. The Green New Deal was our attempt to have a set of policies or a policy framework inspired by the original New Deal under Franklin Delano Roosevelt. You know, it's a jobs program, it's a housing program, you know, it's a conservation, land rehabilitation program, it's all of that. So I think it is possible to put it within a political framework, and Labor under Corbyn was sort of, you know, a little late in getting to that. I mean, it was a few weeks before the election that they started to talk about a green industrial policy. I think it should have happened a couple of years earlier to really bring people along and help people see that they didn't have to choose between caring about the environment and caring about jobs. So I think we have some examples of what this can look like in the political sphere. Unfortunately, those are not examples where the parties are in power in a major economy and able to kind of put it into action. But that can change. That can change.
Great, thank you. Both in the film and in your you know, discussion and your keynote, a number of questions have come in, and I'm going to pick one up from, you know, the Jaipur the literature festival audiences, because they've been particularly prevalent in asking questions about young voices and young people, the next generation. And so they're raising issues about how young voices in the climate change movement, like, you know, Greta Thunberg, are being heard. And do you believe that the kind of steps that young people are taking actually have real impact?
I think they do. You know, it's interesting. I think that Greta and some of the other sort of key young climate leaders, we know about them because they've been invited into these spaces to address the powerful, you know, the elected politicians, whether they're, you know, or you know, they get invited to Davos and they give an incredible speech, right? Or they get invited to the European Parliament, you know, or the United Nations. You know, and if you think about which speeches by Greta Thunberg you've seen, it was probably in one of those spaces. The interesting thing, though, is that, you know, if you ask Greta, and I have asked her, I've had the opportunity to interview her a couple of times, you know, she does not feel that she has influenced the politicians she addresses. She speaks to them, but the influence is what happens when those words and almost like the spectacle of speaking truth to power reverberates in the outside world, right? Like you said that in Davos, you know, like you actually sat there and said, you know, like, don't tell us we're all responsible. There are certain people who are responsible and they're in this room. Did that make them go, oh, I guess I'll stop torching the planet now? You know, I don't think so. But I think just seeing that and seeing that sort of honesty emboldened a lot of other people and inspired a lot of other people. And we see that just in the numbers, you know, millions and millions of people in the streets. It's not just Greta, you know, as I said, Greta's the spark, but it's this whole generation that is the wildfire. And the same is true of the way young people have been in the streets in the Black Lives Matter uprising. There is a real hunger to connect the dots, a tremendous moral courage, you know, and really a desire to go deep, you know, this call to defund the police, right? It's not just about the police. It is a call to move resources from the infrastructure of incarceration, of state violence, to the infrastructure of care, so that people are, you know, have more options and are given a chance and are believed in from the earliest stages of life. It is a vision of a radically different world. And so, yeah, I take a lot of hope from Gen Z right now. I think they're just remarkable, and I think they're having a huge impact. It's just not the impact of the kind of A to B, give a speech to a powerful person, change their mind. I think it's something more complex than that.
Yeah, thank you. And that's raised lots of, you know, another additional set of inspiring questions from, you know, from our audience. A number of them saying how you have inspired them both to do work in this area, but also asking, you know, those kind of bold questions. If what more can they do to make that difference? So just staying on that theme for a second, and then I want to move on to some of the bigger political environmental questions that are kind of coming through. But just so, because there's a whole steady stream of, you know, young people who want to make a difference, and what they're saying is, look, we don't have money, we don't have resources, but it's our future, you know, and we want to do something.
Yeah.
We're trying to create that movement. And I was struck by, you know, the work of, you know, that you referenced in terms of Nino Bassi, which I'm really proud of, is an honorary graduate of York. And a number of our students are saying, we chose to come here because of that activism, you know, a real commitment to sustainability. So words of thoughts, reflections, wisdom to the next generation who want to make that difference.
Wow. Well, that is great to hear. And I know you're already making a difference because you've divested and you're pushing that further, and thinking about what ethical investment actually means. But I think that, you know, I think that the moment we're in is one where, you know, no one's coming to save us. Like, there isn't going to be some savior from on high who's going to make everything right. It is going to be movements from below. And that includes the vision, right? I mean, I think we all have examples of movements coming to the streets and saying no to something, you know, rejecting something, no to a war, no to the cuts, or something like that, right? The moment we're in now requires that we have both the no and a really clear yes, I believe. And you know, tracking the way this idea of the Green New Deal has spread in North America has been really interesting. It, you know, it hasn't come from a political party. It came from a group of young people in the Sunrise Movement, a youth climate movement, that in 2018, after the Democrats retook Congress, they were feeling very good about themselves. Nancy Pelosi was, you know, going to be the new Speaker of the House. They had run on a fairly centrist campaign, you know, much like your current Labour Party, and yeah, we're expecting a kind of lots of pats on the back and a parade going back to Washington, retaking Congress. And instead, hundreds of young people came and occupied the offices of Nancy Pelosi, and they were holding signs saying, you know, Green New Deal now, we deserve a safe planet and good jobs, and had that vision. We're standing behind a clear and transformational yes, which was the Green New Deal. And it was not what the Democrats had ran on, but there were a few insurgents like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the youngest woman ever elected to Congress. And I raise this because it isn't one path. You know, some people will run for office, some people will be on the outside pushing, but it's that kind of pincer. And so you had this group of young people, university-age students, occupying the office of the new Speaker of the House of Congress. And you had a 29-year-old Congresswoman who comes in and says, I'm with you, drafts a resolution for a Green New Deal, and then multiple candidates running to lead the Democratic Party sign on to it because there's so much energy behind it. So really force the political party to change. So I think it is just very, very important that we not wait for other people to tell us what we want. You know, it isn't just enough to just be a pain in the neck. We actually really have to have the kind of intellectual confidence that we know what we're fighting for as well. And so, yeah, that's what these little films that we do are trying to trigger. You know, this is big sweeping stuff that we're putting out there. We need to make it specific everywhere that we are, in every city, in every university. What does a Green New Deal mean? You know, there are universities who've gone through that visioning process, bringing people from different sectors, connecting with the community where you live and making sure that you're, you know, if you talk about being academia, you know, that is rooted in community, that we create spaces where we make that real. And this is a great moment to do it.
Thank you. The challenge around creating spaces, you know, against the backdrop, you know, of political climates, political leaderships, and what we're seeing in the world. And there's a really interesting group of questions around the political climate in relation to, you know, the forest fires, the way that we're using, you know, our resources, the challenge between democracy within that. So let me take a couple of these and group them together and try and articulate them so that we can maybe just pick up on some of those challenges. So again, a question from the Jaipur Literature Festival audience was in the context of, you know, globalization, pandemic, nationalism, against questions that are coming in from a whole range of audiences, particularly the political climate in the UK, the political climate in the US. And there's a point made about, you make some really important and critical points about attitudes towards climate change and forest fires, particularly in the US. And so I guess the question is, how does democracy in regards to pushing forward environmental change work in the backdrop of the kinds of political context that we find ourselves, you know, living and breathing right now?
Look, I mean, I don't think we have political leaders I don't think there's a politician alive who, you know, at the highest level, who is being honest with the people who they're supposed to represent about the fact that we are now living in an age of serial shocks. It is not going to stop, right? We have not listened to scientists. We have not done the things that are necessary to prevent these shocks from continuing to come. Even if we do everything right, we are facing more wildfires, more mega storms, more drought. And the very, very difficult truth is that the space for safe human habitation on this planet is contracting. So that does not mean that everything is lost. It does not mean everybody dies. It means we need to figure out how to share as human beings. We need to figure out how to share within our countries and between our countries. This is a global crisis. It is an unjust crisis. The 20% richest people are responsible for 70% of the emissions. And because of the injustice, because the people who did the least to create this crisis are on the front lines of it, for the most part, are dealing with the impacts first and worst, there has to be a just response. So that has to shape immigration. That has to shape how, you know, when I say that the fires of climate are intersecting with the fires of hate, I mean that the fortressing of Europe, the fortressing of North America, the fortressing of Australia is a response to climate breakdown, whether or not leaders admit it or not. Climate breakdown isn't the only reason why people are moving, but it is one of the reasons, and everybody knows that it's going to be a major driver of human migration going forward. So that is how our current system is dealing with these crises, by hardening borders, by allowing these supremacist ideologies and logics that never went away to surge to the surface. It is true in India under Modi. It is true it is true in Europe. It is true in the United States. Everywhere it's happening. And so we need to provide a real alternative. And this is when I say we don't have politicians who are telling the truth. We don't have politicians who are saying this is the era we're living in. And if we don't want to lose our humanity, if we don't want to become monsters in the face of these shocks, then we have to figure out how to share. So that impacts, as I said, immigration policy, but it also has to impact housing policy. Because when people act poorly, it is when they feel a tremendous sense of scarcity, that nobody's looking after them, right? And that's why, you know, when the pandemic hit, people just assumed that there was no government that was going to look out for them, that there was no rational response to anything. So they go to the supermarket, they strip the shelves, they take all the toilet paper, they assume that it's all on them just to take care of themselves and their own, right? But if we are designing housing policy to assume that we're going to be dealing with more migration, that we have to make affordable, good housing an absolute priority, that's just one of the things that is going to make people feel less panicked and therefore less vulnerable to the demagogues who come around and try and channel that sense of insecurity into xenophobia and racism of all kinds. So there's lots of different, but when we talk about buzzwords like, food insecurity, housing insecurity, all of it, the key word is insecurity. When people are insecure, that's when really, really bad things happen. So when we invest in security and when we build shock absorbers into our system, then we are much, much better prepared for the shocks to come. If you think about how hospitals were so unprepared for COVID, it was because this sort of logic of ruthless efficiency had reigned for so long during the neoliberal era. And what that meant was you never wanted to have more than a few empty beds, right? You never wanted to have any more than the absolute minimum number of nurses to get by, right? Because you're constantly cutting. And so what that meant is that when you actually had a true crisis, you were immediately unable to cope with it. And so if we're honest and say our future is filled with shocks, let's build some shock absorbers, right? You're going to make policy totally differently.
Such powerful arguments on some very, very, very complex issues. Linked to that, my final question, Naomi, we've had a flurry of just incredible questions, throughout your talk, and I just want to relay some of them. And the word inspiring, inspirational, making a difference comes up time and time again. And I want to reflect that in the feedback and also in the kinds of the quality and engaging of the questions. A reoccurring theme in a number of the questions is it all too late, in terms of our carbon footprint? There's issues in terms of China, the UK, electric cars, and yet they've all got complexities. And I don't want to end on a note of not hope. So, and yet I'm asking that, very difficult question, because in some ways people are saying, is there no hope? And there's a lovely quote in here from Frederick Jameson, and I'm just going to do the end of the quote, which says, like in many ways, it's once said it's easier to imagine the end of the world than to imagine the end of capitalism. And so in relation to our carbon footprint, in terms of legacy, what we do now matters. So, your thoughts and final reflections about our carbon footprint and what we do to make a difference that gives us hope, so that we are leaving a legacy and a footprint, not just for today's generation, but for generations of the future, because we owe them that.
Absolutely. And I'm looking at your questions. They're so brilliant and profound, and there are so many. So I am really sorry not to be able to get to all of them, but I am reading them and thinking about them, and I will try to answer some of them afterwards if I can. So I don't think that there is an easy techno fix, right? Which is not to say that I don't think technology has a role. It absolutely does. We need to use all of the good green tech to get ourselves to 100% renewable energy, absolutely energy efficient housing, and building of all kinds, and green public transit, and the rest of it. We all know about all that. But ultimately, we need to, the overconsumers, we those 20% of the world's population who are really responsible for the vast majority of global emissions, we have to consume less. And, I think that if COVID is a teacher, if you go with me on this idea that COVID is this tough teacher, I think that one of the things that we may have learned, a lot of us, is that we don't need all the things that we thought we needed. It has pared down life, or at least it did during the lockdown, to that which is truly essential. And Emma Thompson in the film says, nobody missed shopping. Maybe some people missed it, but what we mostly missed was each other. What we mostly missed was being able to be outdoors. You know, it was so interesting as soon as lockdown was lifted, seeing people flood into parks and trails and beaches. There was just this hunger for the natural world. And so we live in this world where things are upside down, where we don't value that which is truly essential. We make it so hard to spend time with loved ones. We don't value the natural world. We're constantly attacking our access to nature. So it's upside down and we have to turn it right side up. And every time we try to go back to quote unquote normal during this pandemic, the virus surges back. So we have to redefine normal. We have to live at a different scale. We do have to live with less, we over-consumers, so that everybody can have enough. And it isn't going to be an easy techno fix. This is a crisis of the values that have been governing civilization. Our measures of progress are broken, and now they are just so clearly making us sick. Look at New Zealand. New Zealand has had 25 COVID deaths. Ohio has that every Wednesday. 25 COVID deaths during the entire time of the pandemic. Their economy has also contracted by 12%. So they're having to rethink about how to live, right? This is a culture that is, this is an economy that has relied on tourism, but they can't open up the borders to tourists because that's going to mean more COVID. So they're looking at a 4-day work week so that more people have time to enjoy their own country. I think that that's just a glimpse of the kinds of realignments we need. We need more time. We need to value that time. We need to value our relationships. We need to value the natural world. And that's why I think we should be measuring the success of our society based on whether or not we are repairing. We are repairing the damage done to our infrastructure, our natural world, our relationships, instead of whether or not we are growing and whether corporations are profiting, because that measure of success has failed us. So we have a moment where we can go deep because all of the systems, our current systems, are in crisis right now. And if there was ever going to be a moment when there could be a true realignment, it is now, when we have been through this, are feeling it in our bodies, have had this lived experience where so much is on the line. So, you know, no pressure, but I do believe it's an opening.
No, thank you. I want to, on behalf of the university, thank you for what's been just such an inspiring and challenging and disruptive talk. And I want to finish on a real high. And I love that, the right side up. So if I want people to do something, is to take away this notion of the right side up, and repair and care as we move forward in the future. Naomi, thank you. I'd like to now hand it over to Sanjoy Roy, who's the Managing Director of the York Ideals Partner and Jaipur Literature Festival. Sanjoy, please, the vote of thanks and closing remarks.
Thank you very much, Naomi Klein. Thank you so much, Kiran. That was an absolutely brilliant conversation in so many different ways. We need movements. We need young people to take control and push back on everything that we know needs to be pushed back. We need to look at the environment. And one of the most important things that Naomi talked about was being able to find jobs, find sustainable jobs for people, including having more professionals in the area of mental health. On behalf of the Festival of Ideas in York University and all our colleagues at the Jaipur Literature Festival and Teamwork Arts, thank you so much for this particular session, Naomi. That was absolutely brilliant. Thank you for being on this show. Thank you for Kiran Trehan for being the moderator. And I do hope that all of you will return again and again and again to listen to these conversations and perhaps hold and take heart that change is possible and that young people will bring about change. And thank you to the University Student Union for being part of this change and really driving it. So on behalf of all of us, good night, stay masked, stay safe.